Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
On Tuesday night, President Donald Trump appeared before a joint session of Congress for the first time since the start of his second term. He used the speech to deliver a message.
We have accomplished more in 43 days than most administrations accomplished in 4 years or 8 years, and we are just getting started.
It felt like an indoor MAGA rally with tons of cheering and pandering and boasting from Donald Trump and a lot of angry protesting from Democrats.
Josh Green is a senior correspondent for Bloomberg Businessweek.
No music and no dancing, but plenty of fireworks, security scuffle, Democrats getting dragged out.
Mr. Green, take your seat. Take your seat, sir. Take your seat. Remove this gentleman from the chamber.
I mean, it really did remind me of a Trump rally. But it was a partisan speech, sneering and making fun of his opponents and basically dancing on their electoral grave as he boasted about all the things that he's done in his first few weeks in office.
We just talked about the spectacle. Was there substance last night?
I didn't feel like there's a whole lot of new substance. Trump definitely ticked through the things that he's done in the early days, whether it's closing down the borders or blowing up a lot of DEI programs, shutting agencies like USAID. But I didn't hear a lot that was new, and that surprised me a little bit. I also didn't hear a lot about the economy, which I expected would be more of a focal point of the speech, and it was not.
From Bloomberg's Washington Bureau, this is the Big Take DC podcast. I'm Saleha Mohsin. Today on the show, Trump's fifth joint address to Congress. Josh Green and I explore what the president's speech reveals about how he's approaching his second term, from his vision for trade in the U.S. economy to America's role in geopolitics. So you and I covered the first term really closely. So we know that, in an instant, Trump can undo something that he has planned. Based on what we heard last night, what do you think were some of the top foreign policy points that he is trying to focus on for his second term?
Well, it didn't sound to me like he was wavering or about to change his mind on ending the war in Ukraine. I mean, he campaigned on bringing what he called peace to Ukraine, had a big blow up with Zelensky in the Oval Office.
Earlier today, I received an important letter from President Zelensky of Ukraine. The letter reads, Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer.
To me, he just sort of continued the themes that he talked about in the campaign. If I'm going to bring peace quickly, we're not going to waste American treasure abroad. European allies are going to have to step up.
It's hard to believe that they wouldn't have stopped it and said, at some point, come on, let's equalize. You got to be equal to us.
That's pretty much par for the course, I think, with what people were expecting. So no curveballs there.
So let's move on to something that Trump does tout as a unique policy in his administration, tariffs. Josh, did we get any substance or did we hear more just managing a narrative?
The whole speech to me felt like a public messaging campaign, but definitely the lines about tariffs. I'm hearing competing messages from the Trump administration about what it is they intend to do. I mean, Trump has been very straightforward about, he's imposing these new tariffs. He did yesterday. But other figures in the administration like Howard Lutnick are making noises about, maybe we're going to roll those back. Maybe we're going to reduce them. And I think trying to quell some of the market panic that we've seen over the last week. It's mixed messages. It's not clear who is setting the tone here or who investors should listen to. And I think that element of chaos is going to help defeat a lot of the market swings that we've seen literally day to day. S&P is up 1.5% one day, down 1.5% the next, up 1.5%. It's just sort of a roller coaster ride that doesn't show any signs to me of slowing down anytime soon. What stood out the most to me, though, was that Trump did concede just a tiny bit that there's going to be economic pain.
There'll be a little disturbance.
But then he followed up with a very Trumpian line, but we're not bothered by that, or we don't care about that.
But we're okay with that. It won't be much.
Well, I think that remains to be seen whether Americans care or not, because there's a lot of indications in the polls already that consumers are unhappy with inflation. They don't think Trump is focused on the economy, and a new regimen of tariffs that roils the economy and increases prices, I think, is not going to go down politically as well as Trump and some of his allies seem to assume it will. I mean, thematically, Trump has always been consistent in telling this story about tariffs that most economists would say is wrong. Trump believes they're a way to generate external revenue for the U.S. government, that they might replace income taxes, that they're a way that he can kind of exert strength and power over global markets, whereas most economists would say, well, all that's going to do is create cost increases that are going to be passed on to U.S. consumers, which is the opposite of what voters, especially voters who voted for Trump in November, are looking for him to achieve. So I think one of the reasons that markets have been roiled so much, that the entire Trump rally that we saw in the weeks and months after his victory in November has all but disappeared, is that there isn't any kind of clarity on these issues. And Trump didn't provide a lot of it last night.
So was there anything that surprised you about Trump's speech?
Yeah, there really was. I think the thing that jumped out to me most of all was how much he focused right from the get-go on culture war issues and not the economic issues that, to me, are the biggest questions. The cratering stock market, the new tariff regimes he instituted just hours before the speech were sort of on the back burner for Trump. And as I thought about it, it seems to me that's because the stuff that Trump is able to do unilaterally and successfully, things like saying, according to the government, there are only two genders. We're going to wipe out DEI. We're going to win this war on woke. They're fights that he can draw and fight and win on his own terms that Democrats can't stop, and that the public, at least according to polls, is largely supportive of. Whereas if the discussion were about inflation or grocery prices or the price of eggs, which have doubled since last year, Trump doesn't really have that much good news to point to. And instead, what he did was sort of fall back on blaming Biden and the Biden administration over and over and over again for a lot of the economic problems that he and his administration have not yet been able to solve.
We'll dig into economic issues and what we learned about his proposed solutions after the break. I've been talking to Bloomberg senior correspondent Josh Green about the policy substance that came through in Trump's joint address to Congress on Tuesday night. I asked Josh about the issues facing the U.S. economy: inflation, the expiration of Trump's 2017 tax cuts, and the deficit. We heard a lot yesterday where Trump was blaming former President Joe Biden for inflation problems and any other cracks in the current state of the economy.
Joe Biden especially let the price of eggs get out of control.
Which is interesting because it was actually pretty strong. Yes, there were problems, but we're not in a recession. Growth has been strong. Inflation is the biggest problem. At what point is it no longer Biden's economy? It is Trump's economy, and he can't really blame the last guy.
It's a good question. I mean, my kind of gut sense, just having been a creature of Washington for so many years and lived through so many presidential administrations, is that you get about 6 months. And after that, memories fade. People aren't thinking about the last guy, and they start to get grumpy and unhappy. And talking to some Trump advisors and people around him, that's the rough timeline I think that they're looking at. I'd had these discussions less in terms of tariffs and economic policy and more in terms of foreign policy. A number of Trump's advisors were pushing him to move forward on a peace deal over Ukraine sooner rather than later. Originally, I think the timeline had been to do something in Saudi Arabia in May. And a lot of Trump advisors I spoke to at the time said that's too late. By that point, Ukraine will be Trump's problem, not Biden's problem, and we want to do something sooner. And we saw that begin to happen. I think the same timeline basically holds on economic issues too, that if we don't see inflation and grocery prices come down, and certainly if we see them begin to rise as a reaction to tariffs, then I think Trump is going to have a really difficult political problem, because at the end of the day, he's a powerful president with a Republican Congress, but his margin in the House is 3 seats, and midterm elections are looming.
And it's one of those rare moments where Americans are paying attention to what the government's doing because it's directly hitting their wallets. The other one is it is tax filing season. The minute there is any kind of snafu in Americans getting their tax refunds, that could cause some problems and unhappiness too that could emerge in polls and in economic data. So let's talk about DOGE, which Trump talked about a lot, all the so-called waste that DOGE has apparently found. We don't know how much of what Trump said of how many millions or maybe billions have been cut is accurate. That's what DOGE is saying. Bloomberg's reported that, for example, DOGE sometimes double or triple counts contracts that it cuts. They're claiming to cut $55 billion in government spending. Our reporting found that their cuts actually total less than $9 billion. What is all this cutting supposed to add up to?
If you looked at the speech last night, especially the bits on DOGE, I think a lot of it is performative. The bottom line budgetary numbers, the size of the cuts, are quite small in comparison both to the size of this federal budget and to the $2 trillion that Elon Musk originally said he would be able to cut from the budget. If we're talking about $9 billion or even $55 billion, which seems to have been an inflated DOGE figure, this is a drop in the ocean when it comes to the federal budget. And yet DOGE and Elon's actions and his cuts and his assaults on various agencies have really been the main story of the second Trump administration over the last 6 or 8 weeks. From a kind of public messaging standpoint, it's interesting because, again, if you look at polls, people are generally pretty happy with the idea that there's a DOGE out there that's attacking government waste. But if it begins to cut things like the IRS and it slows down tax refunds, or as Democrats have been suggesting, it breaks the Social Security payment system and suddenly old ladies don't get their Social Security checks, then I think there's going to be a backlash, a serious political backlash. But that hasn't happened yet. And so in the meantime, I think DOGE serves for Trump as a kind of illustration of all the things that he is doing and cutting. And I thought one of the most effective passages in his speech was when he ticked through descriptions of some of the programs that Elon Musk had zeroed out.
Just listen to some of the appalling waste we have already identified. $22 billion from HHS to provide free housing and cars for illegal aliens.
DEI initiatives in obscure African countries that Trump claimed he'd never heard of.
$8 million to promote LGBTQI+ in the African nation of Lesotho, which nobody has ever heard of.
It was an effective bit of theater, I think, to sort of illustrate to an ordinary viewer who isn't following this stuff at any kind of a clinical level that the government is full of expensive, wasteful programs and that Donald Trump and Elon Musk are going in there and slashing them in a way that will ultimately benefit the U.S. economy and help with their pocketbook issues. I think connecting those actual dots and seeing an effect on the economy, on unemployment, on inflation, on people's kind of day-to-day earning power isn't going to be easy to do because I'm not sure there is going to be much of one.
When he was ticking through the list of cuts, it was millions. The national deficit is $36 trillion. So like you're saying, it is a drop in the ocean. He's talked about extending some of the 2017 tax cuts, but he's also said, I want to bring down the deficit. Is that math going to add up? Can DOGE find enough savings to make up for all of the budget adds, taxes and other programs that he wants to bring in?
Yeah, I really don't see how it can, especially given what we've seen from DOGE in these early weeks and months, where we're talking about, $10 billion or $20 billion. That's not enough to kind of create budgetary savings that would pay for any kind of a tax cut. Trump and his administration have a lot of balls in the air in terms of claims they've made, promises they've made about what they're going to deliver, including last night. But they haven't passed a budget deal. They haven't ironed out what's going to be in the tax cut. They haven't ironed out how they're going to pay for the tax cut. And at the end of the day, those numbers have to cancel out.
So let's wrap up what we learned from last night. What's your biggest takeaway of what the next almost 4 years will look like?
The biggest takeaway from me is that Trump isn't backing down at all from any of his campaign promises, that he is charging ahead, even as there are clear signs in the economy, in the stock market, and public polls that people are beginning to have a lot of trepidation about how he's proceeding and what it is that he's doing. So the big question for me, I would say, over the next 6 months to a year is something important going to break? Are Social Security payments suddenly going to disappear? Is, the Ebola team that Elon Musk cuts at DOGE suddenly going to have a catastrophic effect if there's some kind of new pandemic? Does a government shutdown, if one were to occur 2 weeks from now, cause a kind of blowback that changes the political standing that Trump and Republicans have right now? To me, it sort of feels like that moment when Wile E. Coyote shoots off the cliff and you can see that he's about to fall, but it hasn't happened yet. And maybe it won't. Maybe Trump can pull it off and do something magical. But the takeaway I had from last night really was that he hasn't changed his views, his plans, or his intentions at all over the first 2 months of his presidency and wants to kind of keep plowing ahead in exactly the direction that he said he would.
All right. Thanks so much for joining.
Always a pleasure.
This is the Big Take DC from Bloomberg News. I'm Saleha Mohsin. This episode was produced by Julia Press. It was edited by Aaron Edwards and Justin Sink. It was fact-checked by Adriana Tapia and mixed and sound designed by Alex Sugira. Our senior producer is Naomi Shaven, and our senior editor is Elizabeth Ponso. Our executive producer is Nicole Beamster-Boer. Sage Bauman is Bloomberg's head of podcasts. If you liked this episode, make sure to subscribe and review The Big Take DC wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps people find the show. Thanks for listening.